Have you ever wondered why some lives carry an invisible power? Why some people walk into a room and the atmosphere changes? Kathryn Kuhlman was one of those people, but it wasn't her voice. It wasn't her charisma. It was something deeper, a presence, a fire, a quiet authority that could only come from one place. What was her secret? How did she become so filled, so completely controlled by the Holy Spirit that miracles followed her footsteps? The answer will both break you and awaken you. Stay with me. She used to say it so simply and yet so powerfully. I had nothing to offer him but my love, and that love it led her to surrender, not the kind of surrender that's casual or convenient, but the kind that costs everything. Kathryn Kuhlman was a woman who discovered early on that if the Holy Spirit was going to fill her, he would have to own her. Not rent space in her life, not visit occasionally. He had to take over completely. You see, most people want the power of the Holy Spirit without the price. They want to be filled but don't want to be emptied, but it doesn't work like that. Kathryn knew it, she lived it, and she never sugarcoated it. To be filled with the Spirit, there has to be a pouring out first, a releasing of all that clutters your soul. That includes your dreams, your fears, your ego, your desire to be seen, understood, or applauded. And yes, sometimes even your ministry. She said once, "The hardest thing I ever did was to let go of my will." That surrender didn't happen on a stage or during a healing service. It happened alone, in the quiet, when no one was watching. That's where God does his deepest work. In the unseen, she gave up her own plans. She gave up her own name. And the moment she did, the Spirit had room to move. There was a time in her life when she thought she knew the path. She had the message, the calling, the platform, but even then, God asked for more. He didn't just want her words. He wanted her breath, her silence, her solitude. And so she walked away from things that looked good, things that had her name written all over them, because she knew they weren't anointed anymore. She would rather have his presence with no applause than applause with no presence. That's the power of surrender. It strips you of what's temporary to prepare you for what's eternal. Some people think surrender is weakness, but with Kathryn, it was her strength, because in surrender, she was no longer operating from talent or experience. She was moving in divine partnership. She stopped trying to prove herself. She stopped trying to fix what God didn't call her to fix, and that made room for the Holy Spirit to take control, not just visit, not just anoint for a moment, but remain asterisk. She once described the moment when the Spirit took full control of her life. She said, "I died that day, and I've never been the same." What she meant was that something inside her broke so deeply, so permanently, that the only thing left standing was God's will. And when you reach that place where your own agenda is gone, where your own voice becomes quieter so you can hear his, then you begin to understand what it means to live filled. Being filled doesn't mean you always feel emotional. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's a holy stillness that settles over your life like a blanket, a quiet knowing that you're no longer steering the ship. Kathryn walked in that kind of stillness, that confidence. Not in herself, but in the one who now had full access to her. And when the Holy Spirit has access real access, there's no limit to what can be done through a life. She gave up her right to be understood. She gave up her desire to explain herself to people who never would. She let go of relationships that once defined her. Because when you choose surrender, you choose isolation sometimes. You choose the wilderness. But Kathryn found out what many never do. The wilderness isn't punishment, it's preparation. And she didn't fight it. She welcomed it. It was never about emotions for her. It was about obedience, about purity of heart, about being emptied so she could be filled, That's the price, that's the invitation, and that's the truth nobody wants to hear. But Kathryn spoke it anyway, not with harshness, but with compassion, because she knew the reward. She often said, "The Holy Spirit is all I have." And you could see it, you could feel it. When she walked on stage, it wasn't confidence in her voice. It was surrender in her spirit. That's what drew the Spirit so close. That's why lives were changed, not because of Kathryn, but because Kathryn had become invisible. All you could see was him. You can't walk in the fullness of the Holy Spirit if your hands are full of your own plans. Kathryn emptied hers, and he filled them with miracles, not because she chased power, but because she chased him. The Holy Spirit doesn't fill the strongest person in the room. He fills the most surrendered. She didn't just talk about dying to self. She lived it, every single day. For Kathryn Kuhlman, the call to walk with the Holy Spirit was not a one-time emotional moment or a dramatic spiritual high. It was a continuous, quiet, often painful decision to let go of self. And if you ever watched her speak, you could see it in her eyes, that deep sense that she no longer belonged to herself. Her will had been laid down, her rights had been given up, and her life, it wasn't hers anymore. That was the secret. Most people want the benefits of the Spirit without going through the burial of self. They want the fire but skip the altar, but Kathryn never skipped it. Every day was another step away from self and a step deeper into the Spirit's control. She knew that God couldn't trust her with influence, power, or revelation unless self was off the throne. Because the moment self comes back, the Spirit pulls back, and she never wanted that. She said once, "I know Kathryn Kuhlman. There's nothing good in her." It wasn't false humility. It was spiritual clarity. She wasn't degrading herself. She was simply acknowledging that the part of her that God used wasn't her flesh. It wasn't her personality or style or talent. It was the yielded vessel, the emptied version of her, the one who had been broken enough that the Holy Spirit could flow freely through the cracks. That kind of death to self doesn't come easy. It comes with crushing. It comes with loss. It comes with silence, especially when you want to speak. It comes with stepping aside when everything in you wants to be seen. Kathryn knew what it meant to die while still breathing, to walk into a room and not need recognition, to serve without being applauded, to be misunderstood and not defend herself. That was her strength, not her charisma, but her crucifixion. And death to self isn't something you graduate from. It's not a lesson you master and move on from. It's daily. Kathryn would tell people, the closer you get to the Holy Spirit, the more he will ask of you. And it's true. The more you desire his presence, the more he will press on areas of your life that still smell like control, still look like ego, still act like pride. And if you say yes to him, he'll lead you into places where your name doesn't matter anymore. Only his does. When Kathryn stood on stage, she wasn't performing. She wasn't striving. She wasn't seeking attention. She had already died in the secret place. So when she spoke, the Spirit flowed. There was no competition between his voice and hers. There was no wrestling for control. That's why what happened in her meetings was so supernatural. There was no self in the way. She had made room, and the Holy Spirit had taken over. Some people think that dying to self is about self-hatred. But it's not. It's about making space for God. It's about recognizing that your best effort without him is empty, that your most polished words, your most strategic ideas, your most passionate plans, without his breath are powerless. Kathryn understood that better than most. She stopped trying to be impressive. She started aiming to be invisible, and in doing so, she became unforgettable. Not because of who she was, but because of who showed up when she got out of the way. There was no formula to her ministry, no script, no routine, just surrender, and that surrender made her a sanctuary, not a stage, a sanctuary where the Holy Spirit felt at home, because she wasn't competing for attention. She was letting go again and again. Every time she stepped forward, she stepped lower, and the lower she went, the higher he moved. Kathryn would often tell people, "Don't seek the gifts, seek the giver," but you can't seek the giver until you stop seeking yourself. That's the heart of death to self. You stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What does he want through me?" You stop praying to be used and start praying to be emptied, and the Holy Spirit responds to that. Every time. This is why so many never walk in the depth of God's power. They're too full of their own voice, their own dreams, their own need to be somebody, but Kathryn had already died to that. That's what made her usable. And not just usable, unstoppable, because the person who has died to self is the person the Holy Spirit can truly live through. She spoke to him like he was real, because to her, he was the most real person in her life. Kathryn Kuhlman didn't reduce the Holy Spirit to a distant concept or a mere doctrine. She walked with him, talked with him, wept in his presence, laughed with him in quiet moments. The Holy Spirit wasn't a guest in her life. He was the center of it. Everything flowed out of that sacred intimacy. There was a deep reverence in the way she mentioned him. She never said it, and never spoke casually about him. It was always he. "Don't grieve him." She would whisper, with tears in her voice, "Please don't hurt him." To many, those words might sound overly emotional, but to Kathryn, they were deeply protective of a relationship that had become her lifeline. He wasn't just her source of power. He was her companion, her confidant, her closest friend. And that kind of closeness didn't happen by accident. It took time, stillness, listening, waiting. There were moments when she would cancel engagements, step away from people, and go into solitude, not because she was tired, but because she missed him. She missed the silence where he spoke the loudest. She missed the presence that made everything else feel small. When you cultivate that kind of relationship, you don't chase platforms. You chase moments with him. So many want to be used by the Holy Spirit, but they haven't taken the time to know him. They want the results without the relationship, but Kathryn understood something deeply. Power flows from proximity. And proximity requires pursuit. She pursued him when no one was watching, when the world was sleeping, when there was no microphone. That's where the oil flowed, in the secret place. The Holy Spirit doesn't rush. He doesn't shout to compete with your distractions. He speaks in whispers, and Kathryn had trained her spirit to hear those whispers. She had made a habit of waiting, not praying with long demands, but listening with long stillness. That's the mark of someone who treasures him. She didn't want to move unless he moved. She didn't want to speak unless he gave the words. That wasn't spiritual drama. That was deep love. She would often say, "The Holy Spirit is all I have." And it wasn't just a statement. It was the truth. She didn't rely on outlines or clever sermons. She relied on his nearness, and when he showed up, the room changed, not because of her, but because he felt honored, welcomed, safe. He had space to rest, not just visit. That's what intimacy does. It creates a dwelling place, not just a moment. People came from all over the world to her meetings, not for Kathryn, but for the atmosphere. And the atmosphere was built on intimacy. That sense that the air was full of someone unseen but undeniable. You could feel it the moment she walked on stage. This wasn't a performance. It was communion between her and him, and the people in the room were simply invited to witness it. She never got too familiar with his presence. That's key. Intimacy didn't lead her to overstep or assume. It led her to bow even lower. The closer she got to him, the more careful she became. And that's what true closeness looks like. Not casual, but sacred. Not common, but costly. It cost her her own voice at times. It cost her her own timing, because when he said wait, she waited. When he said speak, she spoke. When he said stop, she stopped, even if it didn't make sense in the moment. That trust, that flow, that rhythm between her and the Spirit, that didn't come from public ministry. It came from private devotion, from knowing his tone, from recognizing when he was grieved, from backing away quickly when something felt off. She protected that relationship more than she protected her reputation, and that's why he trusted her, because she gave him everything. You cannot be filled and controlled by someone you barely know. You cannot hear the Spirit clearly if the noise in your life is louder than your time with him. Kathryn silenced the world so she could amplify his voice, and that voice guided everything, every message, every miracle, every movement of her ministry, because when you know him like that, when you love him like that, you don't need to chase influence. Influence follows presence. Presence follows intimacy. And intimacy starts with hunger, and Kathryn was hungry.